All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, September 1st, 2005. This incident actually took place on September 2nd, 2005, but this is all in the aftermath of the Hurricane Katrina disaster that struck the Gulf Coast. President George W. Bush is finally on the ground to visit disaster relief efforts. Compounding the natural disaster of the massive hurricane that hit the region a few days earlier was a political and managerial disaster. There was a lack of preparedness, a lack of coordination, what many felt was a lack of empathy and urgency on the part of the Bush administration and other officials. And perhaps nothing captured that more than a phrase uttered by Bush to FEMA director Michael Brown while visiting. It's kind of like a staging facility where they're getting ready to do disaster response. In front of many, many cameras and press, Bush turned to Brown and said, quote, "Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job." No one thought Brownie was doing a heck of a job. Let's just say that plainly. But nevertheless, Bush says that, and it becomes kind of a disastrous phrase amidst a disastrous response. So here to discuss all of that are Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Well, one thing I'll just say is, in my head, it's always been heck of a job, Brownie. And
Same.
Now I'm learning that it's, and that's probably because like that maybe is what like SNL did it or something. But actually, it was Brownie. You're doing a heck of a job. I don't think it really matters, but just an interesting tidbit.
Yeah.
But I wonder if we could talk about it as like this snapshot moment, because I think many of our listeners will remember the aftermath of Katrina. But I think when you remember it, it is in some ways as this sort of snapshot of images, and you have the images of the storm, you have the images of the Superdome, you have the image of Bush looking out the plane window, right? Bush didn't go to the ground. He just flew over it on his way back from the West Coast. And you have this picture of Bush looking out the window, and that was his initial response, was to look at it from afar. You have Kanye on TV saying George Bush doesn't care about black people.
You have Mike Myers staring dead-eyed into the camera.
Absolutely, yeah. And then you have this heck of a job gaffe moment. And those all play into each other and all feed, and they are all sort of this supercut, at least in, I think, a lot of people's heads. And this is, I will say, like, I don't know if we'll do a specific one on George Bush doesn't care about black people, so maybe this is our chance to mention that too and talk about too if you have thoughts. But yeah, it sort of it fits in. But to me, I'm curious, kind of why do we think it was that this specific phrase pops? I mean, people refer to this as the most memorable phase from the entire George Bush administration, which was full of lots of not so great turns of phrase.
Yeah, like mission
moments.
accomplished.
Right.
That's fine.
Yeah.
That sign was a lot. I think this phrase actually becomes a way of describing when someone does something really bad, really horrific, and not so great. And it's like, heck of a job. Like, everyone uses that as this sarcastic way of describing a disaster. And so Bush to his credit, I don't really want to say to his credit, but was trying to boost the morale of Brown and trying to say, like, I know this is a tough job. I know you're working overtime. You're doing great. That's not really, how he should have put that. But that was at least the sentiment behind why he did it or why he said it.
And I think that sentiment is exactly why it hits people in such a wrong way. It's not just how the praise of Brown captures the detachment of the administration, but in this moment, Bush is showing a kind of empathy and reaching his hand out to Brown to sort of boost him back up when he hasn't yet shown any sort of emotion or support for the people who are dying or who are stranded in New Orleans.
Deserted.
No, I think that's precisely right, yeah.
All of this, if you remember just the optics of the backdrop, I mean, you see dead bodies lying in the street, covered up by, little tarps. You see people on their rooftops of their home with makeshift signs out of clothing that says "Send help." You have children that have not had anything to eat, let alone water. There's no access to clean water. You have outrageous stories which were unfounded about violence and rape and all kinds of horrific things happening inside of the Superdome. I mean, you had a lot of really an avalanche of just trauma in images and in footage. And the response was, lackluster to say the least. I mean, Bush was on vacation.
Yeah.
On vacation for a month.
Yeah.
At his ranch, and was hesitant to cut that vacation short. I just remember, and I don't know for you two how your memory is of this event, but because there was wall-to-wall cable news and network news coverage, I remember just sitting there day after day and watching this and being like, wait, why isn't anyone
why is not
going to help? And then this is actually when Anderson Cooper really makes a name for himself, because he goes down there, and in the absence of government intervention is like, why isn't anyone coming down here to help?
Yeah.
And then, the president finally shows up, and this is how he assesses the situation. It was just infuriating to watch.
Yeah.
And, this was, I don't have it directly in front of me, but this was like basically like a staging warehouse, not in the heart of the problem. It was like outside of town. It was like a safe space for the president to be. And then all the things you're discussing, it's like, this is who you choose to be empathetic to, is your coworker, who then is also not doing a very good job. And so I think it was both those things. It was like, this is whose morale you're boosting in this moment, but also your assessment of this. Because if Bush really was intending to kind of like give his administrator a boost, you could do that behind the scenes, or you could just not phrase it the way he phrased it and not do an assessment of the job he's doing, but more just say, we're going to work really hard, or I continue to have faith in you to do what's needed. But instead he does heck of a job, and he uses a nickname. And so, to that, Niki, I mean, you've immersed yourself a little bit in the Bushes in your work, and kind of like, so put that in the context of Bush's sort of like cavalier speaking style and this whole nickname thing.
The nickname thing is such a part of Bush's administration and his personality. It was part of his frat boy personality. He had, as people know, he'd stopped drinking and stopped doing cocaine, but he still had this frat boy energy that he brought to the president. So he would give people nicknames, but they were always kind of diminutive and insulting. So I think he called Karl Rove Turd Blossom.
Turd Blossom.
This is not something that you like. That's a horrible thing to say to somebody. And Michael Brown also did not appreciate being called Brownie, because again, it's belittling as opposed to being something that makes you feel like part of the team. But that was how in the Bush White House Bush liked to operate. He loved to give everyone nicknames.
Yeah, that's all of this is just, it's a real slap in the face for people who are hurting on the ground. There's that moment where Anderson Cooper is interviewing Senator Mary Landrieu, and she's talking about just listening to the politicians thanking each other, complimenting each other, while people are very, very angry and very frustrated to hear politicians slapping each other on the back. She said it cuts the wrong way. And then she says, because literally there's a body in the streets on this town yesterday being eaten by rats because the woman was laying in the street for 48 hours and there are not enough facilities to take her up. So do you get the anger that is out there? She says people are so distraught and livid, and it feels like they're palling around. And I mean, there are no words to sort of describe that kind of anger. And also, I mean, can we just go back to the fact that, like, Brown didn't really have any qualifications to take this job. I mean, he was, like, woefully ill-equipped to do this work.
So this, of course, you know, is the sort of second order story that comes out. It's not only is this guy doing a bad job, and people had looked into kind of why is FEMA botching this response. They knew a little bit about him, but now it was like, oh, here's Bush's buddy. You know, they have this nickname. There's this relationship. Who is this guy, Michael Brown? First thing people learn about Michael Brown is that before joining FEMA, Brown was the Judges and Stewards Commissioner for the International Arabian Horse Association from 1989 to 2001, just a few years before this. He's a lawyer, has a legal background. He'd worked his way in the wake of 9/11 into Homeland Security. He'd done some counsel work there. But really, you know, a big part of his life was the Arabian horse world, which he had to leave because he was mired in scandal, and he had to buy out his contract because he was accused of violating the International Arabian Horse Association's Code of Ethics. Now, I don't know much about International Arabian Horse Racing, but I'm going to assume that their Code of Ethics might be a slightly lower bar than that required to maybe run a giant disaster response organization.
Actually seems higher and more robust than
perhaps,
the federal government.
Yes, I guess we've learned. But nevertheless, you know, people start to look into his background, and it does not help this story either. And, you know, it really, I think, taps into this notion of not just amateurism, but a little bit of cronyism too. With that I think a lot of presidents have had to deal with, but I think there's some of that with George W. Bush.
And this is right before or right after the Harriet Miers affair, where he named, just like a buddy of his, nominated her to the Supreme Court. And not only were Democrats like, no, even conservatives were like, no, like, we want you to put conservative ideologues on the court, not your bud. And so that idea of cronyism was really starting to take hold as a descriptor for the administration. Yeah.
I will say that I'm loath to do the, like, everything needs to be compared to Trump stuff. But I will say, you bring up cronyism. I mean, clearly, like, it makes me think of, there were probably Arabian horse magnates in the Trump administration. I haven't dug too deep.
I'm sure.
I'm sure.
But I will tell you, you know, when I worked at 30 for 30, we did an episode about the Superdome and the history of the Superdome and kind of what that building has meant to the city over decades and decades, including then culminating in, you know, Katrina and the way that it provided a shelter, but was also sort of the home of so much, the symbol of so much of the horror and failure of that moment. And then they rebuilt the Superdome, and that was really important as a sort of symbol for the city. So anyway, as I was reporting this piece, I went back to find audio of, you know, from the moment, and I watched this entire press conference. I remember watching this press conference. It was a couple years ago. And I watched this entire press conference that Bush gave with Michael Brown. And I will tell you that as I was watching that, it just, the way that Bush talked, the way that he was chummy to the important people around him and dismissive to the press, the way that he was reaching clumsily for something that he felt was like empathy, but really was just coming off, as we've been discussing, really poorly. It felt really Trumpian. And I kind of in that moment was like, oh, wow, maybe Bush was more like Trump than we realized. Maybe knowing Trump.
Privileged. Yeah. It's almost like just flippant, you know? I don't have to care. I don't think about this. Not my problem kind of thing. Very, very like upstairs, downstairs. You've got the help, and then you've got, you know, like it just... it felt very much like that.
Yeah.
And it's something that Brown writes in the book that he pens after all of this, where he writes, "The president and his family are not unlike European royalty. They can leave privileged lives isolated from the cares and concerns of the public." And that could have also been written about a more recent president.
Yeah, for sure. But I mean, obviously, to state the obvious, for Brown to be writing that and in that sentence, aligning himself with the public.
Gosh, no.
But,
fall
and so
back,
now,
Brown.
Yeah, exactly. So as we sort of wrap this up, let's look at the aftermath here. I mean, 10 days later, Michael Brown resigns.
Done.
He's gone. And, in some of the writing he's done since, he's kind of has basically said, like, gee, I sure wish I had resigned right before Katrina. That would have made my life a lot easier. It's like, well, thanks, buddy. I'm glad we're all very concerned about how
whose
easy your
lives could have been made easier?
Yeah.
Like, oh my God.
He was not the victim of Katrina.
Exactly. But I would say he has sort of painted himself that way. But he has also continued to kind of like trying, in his mind, I would suppose, correct the record about this. And when people like make jokes about him on Twitter, he jumps in. He says like, no, the disastrous response was with others. Like he just, he's still out there and he still is trying to sort of rehabilitate his, his name and his record. I don't think that will ever really happen.
Also, one more entry into the shamelessness ledger. He goes on to become a conservative talk radio host. And during the Obama years, he's constantly criticizing the administration for how it handles the Deepwater Horizon crisis, Ebola, Hurricane Sandy, which takes some brass, as Joe Biden would say.
Yeah. And then I guess one other note, we've talked about this on the show before, but really this is a true inflection point for the Bush administration. I mean, the Katrina response coupled with the Iraq war going really, really poorly starts to really sink Bush. And, the story of that administration is kind of like they win re-election by the skin of their teeth and, maybe 6 months later probably would not have given so many of the other things that emerge. But, his numbers in terms of sort of being trusted in a crisis plummet after Katrina, and the Iraq war certainly contributes to that. And so it really does, again, as we said, like generally considered the most lasting phrase from the Bush administration, which is saying something.
I don't know. I've also been annoyed recently with the way that people have sort of revamped Bush's identity as this funny, chummy guy, watching him and Michelle Obama, be tickled by each other. And I'm greatly disturbed by that because I'm like, don't forget, this is the same dude, the same guy. Like, but, people have a lot of amnesia when it comes to some of these things.
Anyone want to say anything about George Bush doesn't care about black people? Since this is probably our chance to do it. Do you remember seeing that?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, he put it out there.
The image that's burned in my mind is Mike Myers, who is standing next to Kanye and who just keeps reading from the teleprompter. So Kanye is supposed to say his bit. He says that instead. And Mike Myers just blinks a few times and goes back to the script. And Kanye says something else. And Myers is like his eyes darting around, looking at the production team like, what am I supposed to do?
I think perhaps more than any other album, this is like Kanye's sole contribution to the culture. Let's just put it out there.
Well, it's funny. You talk about, gosh, we have all this amnesia and we don't remember. Like part of that amnesia is also like 2005 Kanye. Had impact on the culture. That's the year the late registration came out. We got to remember how special that was.
Jody.
And then, I know. I'm sorry, but hey, it makes me sad too. But I just remember like seeing this and being like, wow, there's this guy also has this in him. In addition to these two albums that he's dropped over the last 2 years. So
turns out he had a lot of other stuff in him too.
A lot of other stuff in him too. Yeah.
No, that's another episode.
Yeah.
All right. That brings us to the end of this episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter Jackson, heck of a job.
My pleasure.
Again, I want to thank you all and Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job. The FEMA director's working 24 hours.
George Bush doesn't care about black people.
Radiotopia.